All right, so we are recording Happy World Read Aloud Day. We have with us for our third session, Miss Beach. So welcome, Miss Beach. We are so happy to have you with us. Thank you everyone for keeping your mute button on, and you can listen to Miss Beach read, and I'm going to let you introduce your book, Miss Beach.
Wonderful. So I was asked to read maybe a chapter book since we have so many picture books, and I'm pretty good at voices sometimes. So even though there are no pictures to look at, you're probably going to be really entertained because I'm going to make some funny faces like this just so I can get that sounds real good. So it sounds like the different characters. So it still should be entertaining. Now, some of you figured out that I am going to be reading Harry Potter based on my sweatshirt because I am House Gryffindor. But really, here at school, I'm House Willow because we have houses too. So that's what I really love about Harry Potter is I can relate to it a little bit, but it uses so much imagination. And to be an artist, you really need to use your imagination. So that's why I like it.
Now, I'm also House Gryffindor.
That's absolutely wonderful. Next time, can you please keep muted till the very end, okay? I know you're excited. It's so hard. All right, so I have this old copy. Look, it's fallen to pieces. It's got stains all over it. That can tell you how many times I've read it. And my aunt actually gave this one to me, so it's extra special. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Look, my cat even chewed the corner. Good grief. But I love it so much, I will not get rid of it. And isn't a good story like that? It doesn't matter how beat up it is. If it's a good story, you'll still go back to it every time, right? Okay, here we go. I won't be able to read the whole chapter because we don't have enough time, but I'll get you started. And if it's something you like, maybe it's a book you check out at our library here at Brumfield. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, and although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful when she was spent time craning over her garden fences, spying on all her neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret. Their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. Do you know what it was? They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met in several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived on the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they'd never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl fluttering past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Miss Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at walls. "Oh, little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley, as he left the house. He got into his car, backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map? For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had even seen. He jerked his head around and looked again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking? That must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading a sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help but notice there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw in young people these days. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on the huddle of those weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley enraged to see there was a couple of them that weren't even young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that it was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at Grunning's parking lot, and his mind was back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past the broad daylight, though people down the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as an owl spread overhead. Most of them had never even seen an owl at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls, and then he shouted a little bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun in the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily. As he passed, he didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. The bunch were whispering excited too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in his bag, that he caught a few words they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Oh, yeah, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead in his tracks. Fear flooded inside of him. He looked back at the whispers as he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary, do not disturb him, seized his phone, and almost finished dialing his phone number when he started thinking and changed his mind. He put the receiver back down, stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter, and who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew was called Harry. He hadn't even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold or something like that. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he'd walked straight into someone just outside the door. Oh, sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled, almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't even seem upset about being knocked on the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he squeaked a voice that made passersby stare. Don't be sorry, my dear sir. Nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who is gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy day. And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and then walked away. Mr. Dursley stood rooted in his spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger? He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car, set off home, and hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw didn't improve his mood. It was that tabby cat he had spotted in the morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He wasn't sure if it was the same one, but it did have those markings around its eyes. Shoo! Mr. Dursley said loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together to let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with their daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally, but when Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported the nation's owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daytime, they have hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself to smile a little. Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers fall apart from Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people are celebrating bonfire night a little bit early. It's not till next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters? Oh. Mrs. Dursley came in the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he expected, Miss Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't even have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars. There's a lot of funny-looking people in town today, too. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea and pursed her lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son, he's about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What was his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yeah, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down the front garden. The cat was still there. All right, that is my timer to tell me it's almost up. I told you we would not make it to the end of our session, or to the end of the chapter in our 15-minute session, but I hope you really enjoyed it. If you've had a chance to read Harry Potter before, it's so exciting and it's really colorful, very different from the movies. So if you really enjoyed this, I encourage you to check it out with Ms. Hume and Ms. Rice at our library at Brumfield. And I think they have some copies at the Fauquier County Library as well. All right, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me.